OG Rose, and today we're going to resume readings of Longing Again, Part 2, II.1. And we've talked about the importance in Lorenzo's work of neurodivergence to help break up game theory quandaries like Nash equilibrium, prisoner's dilemma, multipolar traps, and how many of those situations, once you introduce neurodiversity, you can actually overcome what would otherwise be a rational impasse, a situation where if everyone does what is rational, you end up with suboptimal results. And we talked about all of that in the context of this kind of question of how does anyone leave Plato's cave on their own? How does one develop intrinsic motivation? Things like that. And so we will be continuing that conversation with a focus on the life of Simone Weil, who becomes an example for us of neurodivergency or mentidivergency, a kind of different divergent way of thinking, which is our emphasis here versus simply a more informed, more educated way of thinking, because that's all going to probably just fall into the pre-existing frame and logic that actually contributes to rational impasses. We talked about the problem of beastocentrism, that I believe we can think of Nietzsche as critiquing in a way that, like Derrida critiques logocentrism, which is a emphasis on receiving values from something external from yourself that bestows values upon you. And if we think of Nietzsche as a critique of beastocentrism, then we can think of it, in contrast to that, something that's going to be emphasizing becoming, which we might put the B in parentheses in honor of Alex Ebert's thinking that came up in the Science of Logic, Hegel course, and Enter the Alien, which was published by Philosophy Portal. I highly suggest you pick up the anthologies that come out of Philosophy Portal. But we can think of becoming as something we might associate with Nietzsche, and something we might associate with Hegel, and we might associate it with also mentidivergence, which is helping us move out of rational impasses. And if there's something about the logic of capital, something about the loss of givens, the current sociological moment, that contribute to rational impasses or various multipolar traps, then we need a logic of becoming. We need a sublation of logic like Hegel offers us from Aristotle, not replacing Aristotle, but sublating Aristotle, which seems necessary so that we can overcome rational impasses. And we are going to focus on the life of Simone Weil for sections. This is chapter 2, section 2, 2a, and it is titled Given Attention to the Meta-Crisis of Affliction. And we will focus on Simone Weil to help elaborate on, bring out some of these ideas of mentidivergence. So we will start reading now. And again, this is Belonging Again II.1. You can find it on Amazon. All purchases and reviews for those who have purchased the book are extremely appreciated. We will also be releasing very soon on 11/11 Under the Wing, which is a short story collection Michelle and I have been working on for many years. We actually started in fiction, so it's amazing how the years go by, but that will be coming out on the 11th. And so you can find that there. The Kindle has been scheduled. It's always fun to make a Kindle version of a book. You're always like, please let all the formatting work. Oh my gosh, please. But there's never any guarantee. So anyway, let me begin reading. Belonging Again, Part 1, discussed the topic of absolute knowers, delusional individuals, and Nietzschean children. All phrases and terms meant to refer to the same kind of subject who can live according to values which are not socially supported, lack givens, and yet still have authority over the subject. They are created by the subject and thus run the risk of being arbitrary and yet manage to prove empowering. A question of Belonging Again was if created givens could orient the average person. And on this dilemma, the question of character was explored. And this is all part 1, Belonging Again. Here, we will focus on the life and thinking of Simone Weil and consider Weil's life in the context of the meta-crisis, to suggest that we should focus on neurodivergence to address it. I do not know if Simone Weil was neurodivergent, but she practically was such in her radical uniqueness and sainthood. Regardless, Lorenzo's work, who we talked about before, suggests that we should not be so focused on evolving our consciousness to overcome the meta-crisis, and instead look to make space for the neurodivergent. And of course, it depends on what you mean by evolving our consciousness. But anyway, This means we need to learn how to be open to the other, and this means we need to learn how to live like Simone Weil. We need to develop the power of attention, she proposed, something Ivan Illich also emphasized, and we need to be deeply part of the world we live in, its common life, to allude to Hume. In my view, Simone Weil is far closer to being the absolute knower and imperceptible delusive individual we need than, say, some intellectual genius. The thought of Nietzsche against Christocentrism also suggests neurodivergence, and I will indeed associate Nietzsche's childhood with neurodivergence. Please note that I don't mean to say that people today discussing the meaning crisis or meta crisis are supporting a life of intellectualism which is uninvolved in, say, psychology. Dr. Viveki, for example, clearly opposes such a life in favor of serious play and deep embodiment. However, I'm not sure if emphasizing embodiment is the same as emphasizing neurodivergence, as I'm not sure if emphasizing phenomenology is the same as emphasizing Simone Weil. Though please note, I, in my work, emphasize embodiment and phenomenology, so this is not a critique of others. Rather, my point is that reading Simone Weil always feels like a wake-up. She aligns with the child, capital C, Nietzschean sense, in that she certainly made her Christianity her own after a very long road from the religion of her family through Marxism and more. Even if she embedded herself in a tradition, it was her tradition. And ultimately, the author of The Need for Roots had to embed herself in a tradition, and yet she refused to be baptized to formally join the church. She kept herself outside. She believed, but did not let this belief bring her comfort. Belief must stick. What is needed to address the problems of belonging again is for us to try to incorporate more otherness and neurodivergence, AB, which is a term we associate with Hegel, into ourselves. But at the same time, I realize that neurodivergence refers to a group of people who are biologically and neurologically born a certain way. So I am concerned that saying we need to become more neurodivergent might sound like appropriation. To avoid this, I'm going to refer to practical neurodivergence as mentidivergence. I also considered animdivergence, seeing as amni means spirit and or mind. For those not genetically neurodivergent, we cannot technically be neurodivergent, but I do think we can implement something like it, which I will call mentidivergence, at least here. We can say that mentidivergence seeks to share an image and likeness with neurodivergence, while aware that this cannot be perfectly achieved, and hence the neurodivergent can never be replaced. We will always need to be open to the other. I will touch on Weil's life to suggest why it is not easy to say she is just more rational or something, or possesses a evolved personality, even if these describe her somehow. That rather the term neurodivergent seems more appropriate, and hence why absolute knowing might be closer to neurodivergence than other descriptions. I do not know, and absolute knowing is an allusion, is referencing Hegel. To resume, I do not know if they was neurodivergent, so I will refer to as mentidivergent, though please note I might be misrepresenting her. Albert Camus considered Simone Weil the only great spirit of our time, while Flannery O'Connor thought Weil was the most comical life she had ever read about, but also the most truly tragic and terrible. Many consider Weil a saint, but many also consider her life wasted due to foolish and even prideful ideals. When Simone was suffering from tuberculosis, she refused to eat more food than those suffering during the war, and in 1943 died because of cardiac failure due to the degeneration through starvation and not through pulmonary tuberculosis, though this account is sometimes questioned. To resist the Germans, she proposed parachuting nurses straight into conflict, which was suicidal. Yet she proposed the idea precisely because it was suicidal, and the Allies needed higher ideals to fight the Nazis. To know what it was like to be a member of the working class, she gave up all academic and teaching posts to work in a factory, and so on. The life and thinking of Simone Weil cannot be readily categorized, and it certainly cannot be encountered without catching our attention. She lived what she believed, and if to a fault, perhaps only because the world misunderstood her. We cannot discuss Simone Weil without discussing her mystical experiences, which suggests that a profound alterology, to use language from Reconstructing A as A, informed her thinking. Her role as a mystic was also unintended, one for which she had not in any sense prepared. And we might say she also experienced a break between the true and the rational, which is a theme throughout O.G. Rose. In this, we see thinking which is free of autonomous rationality, as the neurodivergent often are, and further suggests mentidivergence and how her mystical encounters became evidence of a distinction between the visible church and the invisible congregation of saints, which are never one. They believed that it was easier for a non-Christian to become a Christian than for a Christian to become one, which sounds as if she supports an individual lifestyle which avoids socialization and is able to think outside the consensus, like, say, Michael Burry, according to Lorenzo. She famously refused baptism, and arguably she was not even troubled by the question of formally becoming a Christian, which seems impossible unless she indeed simply didn't have a mind like the rest of us. She enjoyed and dwelt in shadow work, to allude to Illich. She was concerned by the church patriotism which existed in Catholic circles and believed that the church had to be a social structure, but that meant it belonged to the prince of this world. She did not believe it was the will of God for her to enter the church at present, and she was clearly worried about the temptation of the warmth and belonging she would find. Undoubtedly, there is real intoxication in being a member of the mystical body of Christ, he wrote, suggesting an awareness of Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. And Vey did not see herself as able to resist that intoxication, thus keeping herself outside the church. And yet she respected and cherished the church, suggesting a rooted Nietzschean child. The children of God should not have any, and this is her writing, the children of God should not have any other country here below but the universe itself, with the totality of all the reasoning creatures it ever has contained, contains, or ever will contain. This is the native city to which we own our love. Oh, our love. So he sounds like Zarathustra, yes? Amid his animals loving the earth, it is supernatural to die for something weak, Vey tells us, which is to say that it is easy to die for a great political movement supported by the masses, but dying for the animals of Zarathustra, this requires incredible power. Dying for the irrelevant takes a saint. They believed that the greatness of virtues was to uproot oneself for the sake of one's neighbors and of God, and yet she also wrote the need for roots. How can we square this? It is a paradox, but it suggests Vey found a middle way between Christianity and Deleuze. We need roots and tradition, or we wither like a plant, which means we cannot be autonomous children. And yet, we are to treat that tradition as something which we are outside of and never fully included in. We acknowledge its role and necessity, and yet we also acknowledge our inability to be part of it. We believe in conservatism, for example, and yet we do not live conservatively. Is this paradox possible for everyone without conservatism becoming empty and dead? This is a question Vey wrestled with, and how I've come to think about it is by seeing an act of honoring tradition, history, and roots, but precisely in mystical experience, which in my work can be associated with lack, the apathetic, beauty, alterology, and the absolute choice, the river hole, etc. Mysticism can have the role of validating a tradition, and yet it also proves that the absolute is infinitely greater than that very tradition. Something similar might apply to the creative act, engaged in by Nietzsche's children. To create suggests that the world here is worth creating in and with. Mainly, the point is that there is something about mysticism that actually works to validate a tradition which seeks to realize and honor that mysticism. And thus in Vey, aligning herself with Christian mysticism, she also aligned herself with the church she never formally joined. All of these biographical sketches come together to describe someone who seems more mentidivergent. We also know she suffered migraine headaches of an unbearable intensity, one she came to later think of as a special gift, which suggests possibilities of a mind which did not function normally, both to her benefit and torment. For Lorenzo, the power of neurodivergence rests in its ability to avoid situations that the rest of us, stuck in rationality, seem weak to escape. This game theory problem brings to mind what Simone Weil calls affliction, the opposite of attention for her, which I will capitalize to help make that connection in the book. Weil's notion of affliction arose from her time working at a factory, and it is when she also concluded that Marxism and the notion of an inevitable revolution were mistaken, long before the Frankfurt School started considering Freud to explain why the Marxist revolution didn't manifest. They came to understand the hidden nature of oppression itself, which we could align with the hidden ways rationality leads to suboptimal results in Nash equilibria, which I will associate later with discourse. She experienced and felt how working people were forced into conditions which they could not survive or tolerate unless they turned off their minds. It became rational not to think. But if people didn't think, they couldn't escape their situation through rhetoric, as we'll discuss. Though it is not Christian language they uses, it is as if they were totally depraved, which is to say they were utterly enclosed in their situation and themselves. Oppression proceeds exclusively from objective conditions, they wrote, which means our situations influence how we think and furthermore can influence us not to think, which is to say it becomes rational to shut off our minds. As an oppressive situation arises to a Nash equilibrium, arguably for the owners as well, who are spiritually devolved by the condition. And all this is what Wey is referring to once he speaks of affliction, which is basically a simile for a rational impasse, which is into what discourse leads us. And discourse will get into Kafka later on. Funny enough, as a note inspired by a point Alex Ebert made in the Net 69, the feeling of escaping affliction is what can feel afflicting in the sense that now we have to think and deal with tension, while in affliction, or also AA, we feel secure and like things are given in. In this way, a rational impasse can be hard to escape because it feels comfortable. The feeling of affliction can hence keep us in affliction, which is to say that if we start trying to make a house become a home outside of shadow work, as we'll later discuss with Illich, we can start to feel unsure what we should do, like our neighbors think we are strange, like we are in over our heads, all feelings of affliction and tension. For Ebert, a danger with the word affliction is that it might bring with it a moral judgment, and indeed, this is a reason why terms like discourse and rhetoric can be better, as we'll later mostly use, but at the same time, we are alluding to Simone Weil and her understanding of the enclosure which the working class could fall under. We use the terms in her honor. However tied and bound a primitive man was to routine and blind gropings, Weil wrote, he could at least try to think things out, to combine and innovate at his own risk, a liberty which is absolutely denied to a worker engaged in a production line. Our situations deny us the ability to think, suggesting a connection between affliction and Illich's disablement. Just like how a Nash equilibrium denies us the ability to reason our way out of a suboptimal result. Weil's work on force also connects with her thinking about affliction, which is most brilliantly highlighted in her considerations of the Iliad. The true hero, the true subject, the center of the Iliad is force. And to define force, it is that X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing. History is a long story of force and the objectification of people by others, but people also submit themselves to force and can reduce themselves into things. Sociological givens can hold back forces, but they themselves can also cause objectification and dangerous thoughtlessness. Exactly like what they witnessed in factories as a cause of affliction. There is no easy out. It would seem that man is born a slave and that servitude is his natural condition, Weil wrote, bringing to mind Plato's cave, which I would argue is the case because it is natural for humanity to fall into Nash equilibria, situations in which rationality leads us into affliction. To create societies which entail givens that bring out thoughtlessness as dangerously necessary, perhaps in some fashion, for the society to work and the like. We end up in affliction for good reason, and that is the problem. Bad reason leads us into affliction, but so can good reason, all of which suggests how rationality and the neurotypical are naturally unequipped to avoid affliction and Nash equilibria. To be normal is to be primed for affliction, which can be described by the following reflection of Weil. If a captive mind is unaware of being in prison, it is living in error. If it has recognized the fact, even for the 10th of a second, and then quickly forgotten it in order to avoid suffering, it is living in falsehood. Men of the most brilliant intelligence can be born, live, and die in error and falsehood. In them, intelligence is neither good nor even an asset. The difference between more or less intelligent men is like the difference between criminals condemned to life imprisonment in smaller or larger cells. The intelligent man who is proud of his intelligence is like a condemned man who is proud of his large cell. To realize that we are in a Nash equilibria and prone to fall into them is painful, as it is painful to realize that our best efforts to improve the world end up capturing us, Deleuze. Bringing Heidegger to mind, Weil lamented how human beings come increasingly through technical progress to dominate nature, yet remain incapable of dominating forces of control. In fact, there almost seems to be an inverse relationship between overcoming nature and ending up afflicted. The more rational we become, the more irrational the world seems. Why? Well, if rationality and irrationality exist in a dichotomy, perhaps more of one invites more of the other. But it's also because everything autonomous becomes problematic. To lose Hegel's dialectic is to lose something important. The map is indestructible, which is volume 2 of the Truism of the Rational trilogy by O.G. Rose, discusses how pride, intuition, autonomous rationality, and the like can result in a self-enclosure from which there is no easy way to escape, even though it is locked from the inside, to allude to C.S. Lewis. I often discuss the trouble of rationality leading to an internally consistent system, which is a way of viewing the world which we will never find reason to leave, precisely because the variables always align and cohere in a manner that never forces an essential contradiction. So it's completely coherent. Ultimately, but just because something is completely coherent doesn't mean it corresponds. That's the problem. Ultimately, we all must live and operate according to something like an internally consistent system, as we must always live and operate in an ideology. So the presence of an internally consistent system does not prove or disprove anything. Rather, the problem of having to ascribe to a worldview that entails coherence, even if it doesn't correspond, leads us into a consideration of how we grip or hold the worldview, which means all of us should hold our worldviews with an open hand. It's good to see you, John. Yeah, usually bagels will do that. You're correct on that, John. To resume. We have to believe we might be wrong, and yet the worldview will give us no reason in its coherence for us to conclude such. It seems absurd, and yet is necessary. The map is indestructible also discusses the problem of autonomous intuition and pride as self-enclosure, which is to say intuition can position itself as right without conceptual mediation, which can lead to a radical certainty of an insight from which a person cannot easily escape, precisely because they see no reason to escape. After all, they have intuited the truth. Similarly, when someone is prideful and self-enclosed in a system of self-reference, they similarly are stuck inside a certainty from which there is no easy escape. In intuition, thinking is almost viewed as a threat, because to not just accept the intuition is almost seen as trying to think and envision God or something. This is heretical, an act of incredible pride, and in this way, intuition can lead to a person practically worshiping an apathetic God. In both of these circumstances, uncertainty would be a grace, as Michelle has argued. The math isn't the mathing. There you go. Hegel's good to see you, Parsons. Good to see you. What we see in pride and intuition is a system of relation, which arises with autonomous non-rationality, while deconstruction, Pandora's rationality, and totalitarianism arise with autonomous rationality. Considering this, as discussed in The Absolute Choice, we can see why Hegel emphasizes the dialectic between rationality and non-rationality, which could keep both perpetually destabilized yet generative, or indeed both pose grave threats to us and can lead us into a hell locked from the inside. Where Simone Weil calls for a spiritual revolution, I think we can see a call for a return to Hegel, an embrace of absolute knowing, which acknowledges an essential limit to thought and hence impossibility of autonomous rationality, while at the same time making clear the need for conceptual mediation and dialectically working through negativity, which corrects the errors of autonomous non-rationality. We must think and never be done with thinking. The map is indestructible is a phrase we can associate with what Simone Weil calls affliction, which is a state that binds the mind to the point where thinking ceases to occur and a person is stuck. Affliction, intuition, pride, indestructible maps, all of these lead to a state of self-enclosure and self-reference that leaves a person in themselves, AA, and yet there is nothing which necessitates them to stay so stuck. And yet, though they are not technically stuck, affliction, AA thinking, arranges it so that we are practically stuck, and unfortunately, the practical is more real than the technical. There is never a reason or thought, B. No, John, I think I do need like a numbering system for the indeeds. I think you're right about that. And again, it's good to see you. There is never a reason or thought B from AA to AB. In affliction, we would rationally never think to step out of affliction. And yet, at any moment, we could. This is why it is so insidious. The very ease by which we can leave a map makes it all the more indestructible, for it doesn't seem indestructible at all. Its weakness can make us believe we are strong. Good to see you, Mr. Keenan Grant. I hope you are well. Weil's affliction, like maps, meant that working class revolution was impossible. A spiritual revolution would be required. Furthermore, it would seem the neurotypical and average person is extremely likely to fall into affliction and some indestructible map. To put this another way, the average person is likely to end up in a Plato's cave in which nobody ever comes to drag them out, as we have discussed. And Mr. Grant, we're talking a bit about Lorenzo's work on neurodivergence and game theory, and thinking about Simone Weil's life as possibly a sort of modeling of where divergent thinking can help one escape what she called affliction, which we can associate with the rational impasse of some game theory dynamics. To resume, neurotypical motivations. Neurotypical people are more likely to end up living according to extrinsic motivations and unable to leave Plato's cave on their own, which is to say that the neurotypical are naturally inclined to end up afflicted. This isn't to say mentidivergent people cannot end up afflicted either, and indeed not thinking like the greater social order at all can lead to different problems, as we can see in Deleuze, I believe, when essential difference is expressed at the expense of shared intelligibility. Though, as Terence Deacon talk about, there's a take on Deleuze that emphasizes negativity, and I enjoyed his presentation at Philosophy Portal. I will have to see the conclave. I have not seen that. I will have to see that. Ultimately, a dialectic between the neurotypical and neurodiverse is indeed a B, though we as a culture one step at a time. And that's rationality tends toward becoming autonomous. Intuition tends to position itself as all we need. And to be neurotypical is to naturally follow external motivators to align with the social order. And in all of this, we see a gravity, which is another keyword for Weil, pulling us down into affliction, AA, and low-order discourse, which again, discourse is a reference to Kafka. Both Weil and Nietzsche can be seen as thinkers supporting mentidivergence and neurodivergence, for how in the world would anyone even conclude they are in Plato's cave unless someone tells them? Thus the great dilemma. If we hear the story from a philosophy class, we're likely to conclude that the very act of hearing the story means we're philosopher kings. How do we avoid such typical conclusions? Well, we'd have to think differently, but how in the world does someone come to think differently? How do we come to actually live according to Hegel's absolute knowing versus only think we do so? Indeed, these are profound questions, and we might associate spreading the conditions of intrinsic motivation with the question of spreading mentidivergence, which is the question of spreading childhood, all of which I associate with spreading certain material conditions by which these might be cultivated and help us overcome the beastocentrism that makes it difficult to leave Plato's cave on our own, which then also will ultimately lead us into cone dynamics, which comes in 2-3, and what we will later call word spread and voicecraft in honor of the work of Tim Adlin in that community, but more on that later. And thank you, Mr. Grant. It is always a pleasure. Neurodivergence inherently entails an acknowledgement that rationality, once autonomous, becomes its own worst enemy. Unfortunately, Lorenzo warns that it will be rational and tempting to use, say, gene editing technology and gene selection to reduce neurodivergence in the social order, which is to say, we might see a return of eugenics in a subtle fashion. If this were to occur, and if indeed neurodivergence is needed for us to solve the meta crisis, we might be our own gravedigger. Neurodivergence seems to me to be what we should emphasize to escape affliction. Autonomous AA thinking is another way to think of that. More than evolving consciousness or increasing rationality. Not that these cannot play a role or that people cannot mean something like mentidivergence when they discuss evolving consciousness. Language is hard. But I myself think there is value in emphasizing diversity and otherness versus an evolution that may underemphasize, say, divergence. There is something Deleuzian about mentidivergence, and though elsewhere I have indeed been critical of Deleuze and the ways his thinking can dissolve shared intelligibility, the social order, and discredit the need for us to dialectically work through negativity, cheap Deleuze, although again, there is a costly Deleuze, to use the kind of Bonhoeffer language, to resume. I do not want to discount Deleuze entirely, only negate sublate him into Hegel, for Deleuze offers us a beautiful ontology and metaphysics. And that's going to close us for chapter 2, section 2a. We will continue with 2b, addressing gravity and grace, which are key terms for Simone Weil. And we can associate gravity with affliction, grace with attention. And of course, attention is a term that comes up in, say, McGilchrist's work, The Master and the Embassy, I believe, The Matter with Things. McGilchrist is quite fascinating. It also comes up in Ivan Illich, and that's very important. So this notion of awareness and attention, which of course in an attentionalist economy where one's intention is constantly being, say, commoditized or taken from you, then this emphasis is appropriate because much of what seems to be necessary today is learning to have control over our own capacity for attention and to give attention. And that is, I think, very important. But again, of course, the problems that we are dealing with from Belonging Again Part 1 are precisely the loss of coherence. So to talk about mentidivergence ultimately has to lead to a question of how to maintain diversity in a manner that doesn't lose social intelligibility and the impossibility of social ordering. And that is ultimately what our address will have to deal with. So we have been reading from Belonging Again II.1, the address. You can find this on Amazon. Again, all reviews, purchases are greatly appreciated. It is the address. You can also find playlists that go through some of the material. There are presentations on Belonging Again II.1 on YouTube. You can also find the complete playlist of Part 1, an explanation, Belonging Again, an explanation, on YouTube. Many of the sections on Medium. And thank you so much for your time. And again, we will be, as an announcement, we will be releasing a short story collection called Under the Wing. That is wonderful. Keenan Grant came in because he was a huge help for making that collection possible. And it will be coming out on the 11th, which is also Michelle's birthday. So thank you all for your time. And it's a pleasure. And John, Parsons, everyone, thank you for coming by. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for your time.